Hi, everyone. Welcome to Beyond International Women's Day. This is an event sponsored by the Open Society University Network and a gender equity group that is a part of OSUN. And we welcome you and are truly looking forward to a thoughtful, innovational conversation. And we think it's really important to have this conversation right now, even though it's April. We know that the work continues and we need all of you to be a part of this conversation. Before we go into depth about the work, the policy, the narrative, some of the things that we've experienced, as well as action items for you today, we wanted to introduce our colleague, Caitlin O'Donnell, who is the program manager for the OSUN Civic Engagement Initiative, who is going to welcome you on behalf of OSUN and just give you a little insight. So with that being said, I will transition it to Caitlin.
Thanks, Cammie. Thanks, everyone. Welcome. I really just wanted to talk about the incredible expertise and experiences and knowledge that our panelists and our moderator are bringing today. I work with the OSUN Gender Equity Working Group, as Cammie said, and as you might have seen this March, which was literally 3 days ago, we wanted to put out big across OSUN, across our various campuses for Women's History Month, International Women's Day. And two things came up as we were planning the series and stepping out big and having our campuses and our community really pay attention to gender equity in a real way. One was that we wanted to focus on the expertise and the rich knowledge of our own students, alums, and staff and faculty within our network. A lot of times if we're planning big events, we always think external, who's from University X or think tank X that can come into our network from an external perspective and teach us. But we really wanted to then value and put a spotlight on the expertise and knowledge of people from within our community. So in, out, and in dialogue with one another. So the series, and this is just a great example, this is our last official event of the series, and the series did a really good job of putting a spotlight on that knowledge. And I know, Patricia, you were part of panels, throughout the month, and I'm sure these other folks on the panel were part of other events, and I think it's just a really good reminder to focus on the expertise of folks within our network. And then the second thing that came up for discussion was, okay, great, we can do 10 events in March. Well, what does that actually mean? And where do we go from there? And that was really the genesis of this conversation that we're going to have today. We can't obviously stop at a month. The month has meaning, a day has meaning, but what are we doing in April? What are we doing in May? How are we continuing to put a spotlight on some of the issues that we were having discussions about and issues that we need to really grapple with constantly? And so this brings us to this conversation, and we really wanted to highlight, also that Gender Equity Month, International Women's History Month, the field of gender equity is constantly changing. And so what it looked like last year is going to look totally different than what it's going to look like next year, different meanings to where you are in the world and maybe to where you are kind of individually. So I think this conversation is just going to be really interesting and set us off for tomorrow when we go out, step into our offices, step into our classrooms, and continue the conversation and continue to have these issues on top of our minds. So with that, I think we're just really happy to be here. This is going to be a great conversation. Thank you. And I'll turn things back over to you, Cammie.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Caitlin. That was just such a great introduction and foundation to the work that's being done within OSUN, what we hope to accomplish today, and what we hope to continue to focus on in regards to gender equity. I first wanted to just introduce myself and kind of lay down the foundation of this work. So my name is Cammie, my pronouns are she, her. I'm your moderator for today. I serve as the Senior Fellow for the Barr Center for Civic Engagement, and I'm really happy to be engaged in these particular topics. In addition to being a Senior Fellow, I teach classes on women in leadership in the pandemic, and I have worked in the field of higher education for over 6 years in different capacities, focusing on civic and social justice work. So we're here today to really talk about the momentum that we must keep, as Caitlin talked about, in regards to gender equity. We are profoundly filled with hope and gratitude that we have moments to acknowledge how far we have come in regards to the fight for our rights. We've seen this be highlighted, as Caitlin mentioned, in March. There's these equity pay days and International Women's Days and more. But we also know that as we transition, especially now in a post-pandemic era, so to speak, that this fight isn't one that can be fixed in a day or a month. It's ongoing. It's all important. And gender equity is not only a fundamental human right, but it really is a necessary piece of foundational work for a peaceful, prosperous, and sustainable world. We know that there has been progress, and we want to acknowledge that over the last decades. But if you look at recent reports from the UN, the world is not on track to achieve gender equity by 2030 as they thought. The social and economic fallout from the COVID-19 pandemic has made things quite difficult for people who identify as women and marginalized communities. Progress in areas such as education, unpaid care and domestic work, sexual and reproductive health, and gender responsive budgeting and pay has fallen behind. And during the pandemic, we saw women's health services be poorly funded. We saw domestic violence increase, loss of jobs, lack of support for childcare, as I mentioned. And despite women's leadership in responding to the pandemic as being frontline workers, many of you served in these roles, community leaders, mayors, prime ministers, I'm thinking biologists, just champions for change, we still unfortunately trail men in being included, heard, paid equitably, and securing decision-making decisions and positions that we deserve. And as the UN has stated so well recently, I was reading up, commitment and bold action are needed to accelerate progress, including through the promotion of laws, policies, budgets, and institutions that advance gender equity. Greater investment in gender statistics is vital. Women and girls, they represent half of the world's population and therefore also half of its potential, but there persists to be this stagnation in some areas of progress, which is why we're here and why it's imperative that we continue to have these conversations about empowerment and equity rights post-March. For the ongoing need of change is not just a month's focus, it's a 365-day focus. And so with that being said, I am so happy to introduce you to our wonderful speakers who are going to introduce themselves first before we get into the questions. And they're going to guide us through how this next generation views the work that has been done, what needs to occur, but also setting you up with ideas for action in your own spaces to do the work, because there's so many different pathways to doing civic engagement. So with that being said, I am going to transition to the introduction of our speakers. First, I am transitioning to the person to my right, and that is Patricia from CEU. And Patricia, you can pass it to Emmy, Emmy to Yalda, and so on.
Thank you, Cammie. Hi, I'm Patricia. I am a recent graduate from Central European University in Vienna, where I did a master's in nationalism studies with a research on women in politics, more specifically in women that are working with in far-right parties in Central Eastern Europe. And now I am working as a coordinator for OSUN community engagement programs at the Central European University. And I'm very happy to be part of today's panel. And I am transitioning to Emmy. Looking forward to it.
Hi, everyone. Good to see you all. My name is Emmy. I'm a sophomore economics major at Bard College, Annandale. And I'm also an OSUN Global Fellow. Thank you so much for being here. And I'll pass it to Yalda.
Hello, everyone. I'm Yalda, originally from Afghanistan and currently studying at the American University of Beirut, majoring political studies with focus on international law and gender studies. And I'm a Muslim Global Fellow and really glad to be here today with you.
Thank you, Yalda. And though she's not speaking today, she also is part of the foundation to the Gender Equity Group. Christina, did you want to quickly introduce yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Cammie. Hi, everybody. I'm Christina, she, her. I'm this year's OSUN Gender Equity Programming Fellow. I'm really excited to have been in this role and continue to learn from all of you. It's been amazing this month, and it will continue to be amazing. Yeah, that's really my introduction. I graduated from Bard Annandale in 2021.
Thank you so much, Christina, for being here with us today. And so now I'm going to transition to why you're here, and that's to join a conversation with us. I wanted to share that we will provide opportunities for questions and answers at the end, but if anything comes up or thoughts or ideas, you definitely can utilize the chat. In order to ask a question, just type it in the chat at any point. When we do Q&A, you also can raise your hand. We'll give you guidance about that. But we plan to have a thoughtful dialogue, and questions will be answered throughout the conversation. So we'll definitely make sure to be on the lookout for what's happening in the chat for today. And with that being said, I want to transition to our conversation. As we said, today's conversation is really concerning the ongoing ideas around gender equity and what does that mean, but also understanding that there are inequitable experiences that women and people who identify as women face today, especially as we're going through all these different transitions. And we know that based on your location, your background, your socioeconomic status, that impacts how you're viewed in the world, and also how you view gender equity from your lens. And so one of the first things I would like to ask our panelists to do is just, can you share your thoughts on what gender equity means to you? Your experiences, and why are we still in a space for fighting for gender equity? And so first I'm going to start with Patricia, and then we'll just continue to pass it on.
Thank you. And I will answer your questions backwards. So I will start with the last.
That's fine.
So we are in 2023, and we are wondering, why are we still dealing with gender equity, and why do we still need to advocate and lobby and create programs that are dealing with this, and why is it not yet done? And the answer would be the fact that we are still living in societies that are prone to have patriarchal thinking. We are still living in societies where inequalities are severe and extreme, and this is happening especially because the historical wrongs that women were faced with are still not resolved. And that is what gender equity means to me. It's not gender equality, because this would simply mean providing women with the same treatment as men, whilst gender equity for me refers to us trying to go one layer deeper, understand the causes for which there are these discrepancies still existing in the society, and trying to come up with programs, instruments, and tools in order for us to be able to tackle, defer, and hopefully try to find the balance and make sure that not only economically and socially, but also mentally, there is equity, and there is women are treated the same way as men.
Thank you, Patricia. I'll transition to Emmy.
Yeah, thank you. So to me, gender equity is about leveling the playing field. As we all know, women experience discrimination in various ways, including the pay gap and barriers to promotion in the workplace. Just to give a couple of examples. And I think that achieving gender equity requires active efforts to end these problems through legislative advocacy and social justice organizing, which is part of what I'm sure a lot of us do all the time. I also think an important piece is ending gender-based violence. So sexual violence happens to people of all gender identities. I want to acknowledge that. However, there's a systemic subjugation of women that is perpetuated, I think, by mistreating and abusing female bodies. And I think this upholds the patriarchy in a way that marginalizes and disempowers women through trauma and violations of safety and autonomy. And I also think intersectionality is a huge part of this conversation. And I think the way that I've gained a fuller understanding of what intersectionality means is while I was volunteering in a rural village in Kenya, which is just a very different culture than what I am used to. And there are very traditional gender roles upheld in this community. And so I watched the people around me conform to these roles. And where women were primarily responsible for household labor, which I think is something that's common in a lot of different areas, but it just was so stark. And it just kind of made me reflect on the nuances of what womanhood means in different cultures and societies. And like the inequality was just so observable there. And I don't want to take up too much time, but I'll just add one more thing about why we're still talking about this. And I think at this point in time, the patriarchy is just so baked into our social and political system, and it's internalized so deeply that even if we don't realize how we're perpetuating like gender inequality, it's just a part of everything we do, just like, you know, systematic racism and all those things. And I'll pass to Yalda.
Well, gender equity for me is basically when women are not deprived of their rights because of their gender. And we have to acknowledge that we have come a long way for this, but still we have a long way ahead. For example, in 2023, in my country, girls are not allowed to go to school or university just because they are girls. Like, we had the right to access higher education and a school, and we had this. And I think it's the most devastating and sad part that we have to fight for the same right again and again. Like, hard work and struggle of decades have been lost overnight. So that's why I think we have to work in different levels for gender equity. It's a fight for gender pay gap, or even it's a very basic human rights that every human being should have, like education and accessing to school, that is taken away from Afghan girl. So that's why I think that we are still in this fight. We are achieving rights that we must have, or we are losing on the other side. We have to fight back and fight again for those rights. And one key point that I want to highlight is that that's why it should be a non-stop and continuous process to work for this. And I'm glad that within OSUN, we are not taking it just a celebration of 8th March or 1 May, and we are taking it beyond that.
Wow, thank you all so much for these thoughtful responses. There were some interesting themes, just really talking about how patriarchy is deeply embedded to all of our societies, and we are representing so many different aspects of the world, and how societies are prone to these inequities and the historical wrongs that some of you mentioned, the violence, the trauma, these cycles that we continuously have to fight. And I kind of wanted to go into the direction of the conversation about intersectionality, because we do represent different roles. I would say if you have time to look up intersectionality, it's a very important term that was coined to really talk about the intersection of Black women and the different roles that we have in the United States. We're not just Black, we're a Black woman, we're first gen, we're a leader in our community, we're mothers. There's all these different roles, and people forget that, and they can't be separated. And so I think it's important to acknowledge that we're having this conversation about equity and equality because of this climate, this patriarchal climate that we live in. And we're in this constant state, it feels, of proving ourselves because of the patriarchy and the inequitable systems that we live in, whether it's our credentials we have to prove, or even worse, if we have a credential, sometimes we can still be seen as invisible players in society. And oftentimes the intersectionality of who we are is forgotten. And then when we do show up authentically, because then we hear that, there's the comeback of let's show our full selves. When we do that, that's not always accepted. So what I'm getting to is that there's this push and pull of trying to represent and show who you fully are, then realizing that depending on your environment, whether it's your school environment, your home environment, you're not always fully accepted. And that can be frustrating. How do y'all overcome these barriers or manage them, I should say? How do you navigate the pressures from society, whether that's, for many of you, I know you have a home country, you have this home community, but then you have a school community that you're in as well to better yourself so that you can focus on your development as a human being. So how do you navigate these pressures, and how do you overcome that push and pull that you constantly feel? And I'll do reverse, and I'll start with Yalda with this question.
Well, I believe that a key way, specifically in individual level, based on what I know, is to kind of start questioning the norms and all these fixed norms that come from traditional society. Specifically, I'm referring to developing countries, because it's the tradition and norm within society that decide and dictate how women should act, what should women do, what should even believe. And at some point, even the women start to evaluate themselves based on those norms and criteria. So that's why I think we need an unlearning process, questioning those norms and fixed norms, basically, that come along the way of women. And an example of that can be the movements of women around the world, that it's not only tradition. When the women reached actualization, that there's the government and how women's rights have been politicized. For example, the movements of Iranian women is a great example of that. These women reach the self-actualization, that their rights are being taken away just in name of the religion and the so-called government and Republican stuff. So they start this movement to achieve their freedom of speech, their independence, their freedom of choice. And still it's ongoing. So I think one of the, in individual level, if I want to say, is that it's the unlearning process of these fixed norms and ideas.
Amy, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, thank you. So firstly, I just want to echo what Yalda said about unlearning, because I think that's super important. And it reminds me of an experience I had a couple years ago while I was working as a youth facilitator for a social justice organization called the Yalda Network. And we spent an entire summer basically doing this program called the Summer Institute, where it was all about confronting our own internalized hegemony and racism and misogyny that we, and kind of decolonizing our minds, just really thinking critically about our beliefs and how we go about our lives, and kind of connecting that to bigger societal issues. And it was really revolutionary and enlightening for me. And so I think that everyone should have the opportunity to participate in that unlearning. And I think a really great place to do that is finding a community of like-minded people, and educating yourselves together, and working with each other to decolonize your mind and empower yourselves as women. And on a more personal note, in response to the point about intersectionality of our identities being forgotten, I oftentimes feel like I have to choose between Blackness and womanhood. And a lot of racial justice issues are centered around the criminal justice system. And while I will always fight militantly against this type of systemic racism, I feel that Black women are often a neglected part of this picture. So that's something I struggle with. Yeah, and then also just as a Black woman, I feel a lot of pressure to outperform everyone. And a lot of that comes from me. And so I think it's just, again, back to the internalized misogyny and anti-Blackness, and it manifests in me feeling like I need to compete and be better than everyone else just to have a chance to take advantage of the same opportunities that my white or non-female peers have access to. And so I'm just working on letting go of that competitiveness and feeling okay with not being the best and making mistakes and failing sometimes, because it's something that everyone has to do.
What I would add is a bit of an opposite view on this discussion about us trying to decolonize our thinking and to get out of this innate ideas that were ingrained in us due to the societies that we were growing up in. And then this comes from the research that I've been doing on women in ultranationalist parties. And that is, I would say, a bubble that is not so much looked at, because usually we are trying, what is happening is that we are not really paying attention to these women that seem that they don't want to evolve, they don't want to get out of these paradigms of patriarchy, and women should be mothers and wives before anything else. And what I've discovered is this amazing concept, which is called alternative emancipation, which refers to the fact that for this category of women who are not necessarily fighting patriarchy, who are not necessarily fighting to be seen. For them, it's more important to be accepted. And the far right in this case, especially in Europe, has been providing them with this safe space where they are accepted for the way they are, for the fact that they position themselves first as mothers and after that as women, for the fact that for them this intersectionality between being mothers and women and politicians is seen as something totally different, and even more encouraged, is also a nice and interesting way of looking at what we can learn from the other spectrum, so to say, and what we can put in practice. Because what is happening with women generally is that we are always promoting gender equity, and we are always talking about the need to be seen, the need for our voice to be heard, the need for us to be respected. But then in the whole journey of doing that, sometimes the message doesn't come across the way we want it, and then we tend to position ourselves in this sort of disagreement and to antagonize the other part of the other side of the table. And this is something that makes the progress stop, and it's creating more and more hurdles sometimes. So what I've learned as a researcher is that sometimes it's good to look at the other side and see what we can learn from there and try to adapt in our side. And what I've learned as a woman is that, especially if you're coming from a patriarchal society like the one that I'm coming originally from Romania, which is a post-communist country, which is also the country in the European Union with the lowest pay gap, but still, this doesn't mean that women are not discriminated. And what I've learned as an individual is that no matter how much I fight for my rights, and no matter how much I try to position myself in a place where my voice can be heard loud and clear, what is the most important thing to do when I'm trying to navigate, especially with these groups of people that are still stuck in this patriarchal thinking, is to make them understand that I am not a threat, and my way of thinking, which is in comparison with them sometimes a progressive way of thinking, is not dangerous, but it is something that they can learn from, and that will help them in the long term have a better integration of both women and men, in not only in politics in this case, but in the whole societal framework of a society. Yeah, I think I would end with that.
Yeah, so this is complex, and I appreciate the difference in dialogue and the different perspectives of how to approach and communicate in regards to the message around gender equity. I think the important piece about intersectionality, and I connect with a lot of what all of you have said, is that who is the message for when this is said? And I feel that at times certain groups are left behind in the conversation. It's not for everyone. And I think one of the first steps that I felt like I heard a theme around was, questioning the norms, and not only just questioning the norms about the patriarchy, question the norms of the gender equity movement as well, and who started that, and who had to create their own pathways because they weren't included in these conversations, and confronting that history so that as we move forward with the alternative conversation, that we're not neglecting those who need to be a part of it. I think what is a difficult and interesting conversation that's not always held in civic engagements, that in a lot of ways this work is not always inclusive, it's exclusive. And I'm talking about civic engagement just in general. And that's something that I've seen for quite some time. And so as we're transitioning to this conversation of finding community, because it felt like that was something that all of you were saying, is that we're dealing with all these messages and questions and pressure, but it's a process, and community and like-minded people are really critical to helping you gaze this conversation, move forward in your path to understanding, and then also being able to educate others. So we've been discussing the barriers to equity. But I wanted to transition us a little bit based on this previous conversation to a little bit around solutions, not fully, but ways that we can create communities to support those who identify as women in this fight. And can you share how, each of you share how you stay inspired? Because a lot of the things you just mentioned in the first two questions make it very difficult sometimes to stay motivated. So can you share how you stay inspired, have connected with other women leaders in your community, if that's even possible? Because the reality, if we're talking about the not so fun side of this, is that not all women support each other either, if we're being honest in this work. So it's the three parts, like share what inspires you, if you've been able to connect with other women leaders to do this work, and then based on what you've learned, how do you then create models of care that leads to pathways to gender equity in your work? So what I'm going to do now, sorry, y'all, I'll start with you, Emmy. I'm trying to be fair here, who to start with. So
Yeah.
Emmy, I'll start with you first.
Okay, thanks. So starting with ways I feel inspired by and connected with other women leaders is really just by surrounding myself with powerful women or people that I find powerful that are not cis men. And so the example that I'm thinking of right now is I have this really great economics professor who's a woman, and she's my only female professor that I've had in economics in my time at Bard. And my first class I took with her, I just honestly felt so like infatuated with the work she does. And she's like so unapologetically feminist in her classroom, like, and gives women the platform to speak, and is not like, she's just very outspoken about trying to bring more women into the center of economics, which is a male dominated field. And so I just have worked really hard to get a job working for her as a research assistant, and I just like want to be in her orbit at all times. So I asked her to become my advisor, and that's just the advice that I have, is like find women that you find powerful and inspiring, and just like try to be around them, because it's really like motivating, and it's really helpful to have a role model to look up to and strive to be like. And so I think I've also used the support from other women in my work outside of school, in my civic engagement work specifically. So there have been times where I felt taken advantage of and disrespected by male coworkers and supervisors. And so I've confided in this group of women that works for the Center for Civic Engagement at Bard, who have really helped me navigate the situation, and especially in a way that I feel comfortable. And yeah, I just feel really supported by that group of women. And I think that modeling care and support towards a pathway of gender equity is really about building those types of communities that you feel safe with and supported by, and holding people, especially men, accountable for, you know, their actions, and having empathy and compassion for one another. And I also want to shout out Caitlin, who's on this call, because we were having a conversation a few months ago, and she shared a specific way of team building that she practices with her coworkers, where they pick up the slack for one another and share tasks to allow like some people to slack off for a while or take breaks, and really take care of themselves. And the way she described this relationship was way more beautiful and eloquent than what I just said. But I think that it's a methodology that I would love to adopt in my work around gender equity and social justice. And I'm like, just really, I think that's a really nice way of building community and yeah, holding space with one another. And I'll pass it to whoever wants to talk now.
Patricia or Yalda? Okay.
I can go. So to be honest, I only started working on, so now at the moment I am working with, my whole team is made up of women. So I'm working in an all women environment, which is amazing. But this happened only very recently in my life, because I have started my whole leadership journey and my whole civic engagement journey working in teams where I was the only woman. And that was such an interesting experience because I was lucky enough to be working with men that were extremely supportive and that were encouraging me at each and every step. And it's thanks to them that I've managed to somehow also acquire, if I could say, this men attitude where I'm very direct, very straightforward. I know what I want and I know how to put a problem and obtain what I want. But it's nowadays I am focusing more and more towards working with women, towards empowering women. And my inspiration comes from actually, my latest inspiration when it comes to women is the women in far right, not because of their ideological opinions, but because of the perseverance that they have when it comes to fighting the discrimination and the stigma that they are faced with when trying to promote as a politician. Because it happens that they are not attacked because of their political positions, but because of the fact that they are women. And the way that they are withholding this and the way that they are fighting is a true inspiration, especially because I've been always supported and I've been always empowered by the people around me. And I sometimes took it for granted. And it's nice to see that, look, there are things happening outside of your bubble. Things are not always as pink as you think they are. And you have to be humble and you have to be modest. And apart from these women that I've been examining and interviewing and working and looking closely at in the last year, my inspiration comes from my coworkers at CEU and at OSUN. And I was so lucky to work in it. I'm so lucky to work in a team of extremely competent and perseverant women. And the way when I look at them and I see the way they are mingling with everything, with personal life, with amazing projects that they are organizing, with this dedication that they have for their job, it just makes me go further more and more and more. And I think that also the most important thing, apart from all the competencies that we as women acquire along our during our life, is the capacity that we need to build in order to forgive ourselves when we don't manage to do something correctly, and the capacity to be understanding of each other and not to bring out our competitive side in moments where we don't have to bring it. Because this is what happens, because we may not be having as many options as men when it comes to jobs, but even those that we have, we tend to be ultra competitive with each other. And this doesn't help in the long term. So yeah, I just hope that we can be more, we can surround ourselves more with competent and inspiring women. But at the same time, I think that we will be able to give ourselves, cut ourselves some slack and just don't take ourselves so seriously when it comes to competition. And I will pass it on to Yalda.
Sure. As Patricia and Amy point out, for sure, seeing women who are women leaders and who are working for empowerment of women is a true inspiration. And specifically, as Amy mentioned, I noticed that when it comes to professor and those who are advocate of gender equity, the class dynamic totally changed. Everything is much better when the professor focus on the issues. So that's the impact of it within the higher education system, but also within the community. Personally, I meet so many inspiring women within OSUN, virtually, like Miss Cammie, and also we meet in person, Kathleen, Patricia, and my coordinators are Sarmas. All of them inspire me so much to start my own project and start working as a campus leader within American University of Beirut, because it gives me the sense and belief that even if I can inspire a small group of students, they can start inspiring others. And this way we can expand our works and achieve our goals in the end. So that's why I think sometimes just seeing the women who are leaders who are working for this give us a sense of inspiration to know that there are other peoples out there who are working for the same vision in different ways, but at the end we all have the same vision. That's a true inspiration for me to have this vision in mind and work for it through that. And also that's so much valuable for me, the OSUN community that give me that sense. And one more reason that I'm always feel like inspired is I feel responsible, especially as I'm coming from Afghanistan. And as I have the opportunity and I have the and I can work for this, I personally feel responsible to work for it. And that sense of responsibility also makes me inspired.
Thank you so much. Before I transition, because there was a lot said here, I think my favorite thing, I feel like y'all all said it in different ways, is just being kind to yourself and being gentle and forgiving yourself. Is really critical to, I guess, sustaining yourself, because it's a marathon, it's not a sprint in regards to doing this work. There was a mention though of, because we want to talk about skills, the team building thing. I don't want to put you on the spot, Caitlin, but could you quickly share like what that was that you said? Because, you know, this is an environment where when we hear things, we want to share it. So what, or do you remember what the team building piece was that you shared with Emmy? It could probably be very helpful for a lot of us here on this call.
And Patricia helped because we were actually, and this is something that is unique to OSUN and that we're really proud of, is that we bring student leaders together. And in particular, we brought student leaders together back in January for a retreat for skill building and then just coming together. And we had a particular session on looking internally as leaders and looking at what we can do to sustain ourselves and how can we sustain kind of each other. And as leaders, we're not only setting the tone for us, but we're working in teams, we're influencing others. And I think the conversation was that the question was, you know, how do you support the folks around you? And that's really where that came from. Like, we've been through a hellish 3 years and plus. And so I think, and maybe what's different with perhaps like a woman forward leadership, how we connect, is that we are aware of what others might be going through on a team. And I think that I've learned through my interactions and relationships is to take that all into account and recognize people as like, you're one version of yourself, you bring part of yourself to work, but you don't see what else is going on. And so if you're in a position to take up more of the slack or to let kind of things fall off the wayside in support of the marathon, like Cammie said, do it, like that's fine, you know. And then you might be in a position that you're going to need to have the slack to have some slack for you, or to have some things taken off your plate. So that's just a way of connecting with one another in a way that teams can work, that it's you're not kind of judging, you're not keeping 100% expectations on someone when clearly they're, you know, they might be not able to kind of deliver 100%, and that's okay. And so I think that's where that adds some light to the conversation.
Yeah, that's really awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that, Caitlin. We're always looking for examples because we think it's critical to keep this movement going, like those key skills that you can do. I think what's really interesting is that in a lot of ways, I come from a spiritual mindset. It's like just showing people grace and the fact that we haven't acknowledged in some aspects as a community what the impact has done to us, or not the impact, what the pandemic's impact has done to us. And what we're carrying, especially as women. The stats, I could talk about it all day. That's for another conversation. But those who identify as women really took the brunt of it in so many different ways. And we're holding that. And it's important to build that community of support to continue on, but to also show each other grace when we may not fully reach what everyone is expecting of us. We're human beings at the end of the day. And as I always say a lot, we're doing our best. And I say that at least 5 times a week. And that's actually a good transition, because all of you started talking about OSUN and you represent this network in a lot of different ways. So I want to shift the narrative a little bit to talking about pathways in regards to policy and avenues for equitable and sustainable initiatives and movements. towards gender equity, but particularly looking at OSUN, which has so many different opportunities and pathways. And not just OSUN, but just educational spaces in general. So when we're thinking about a global network or an educational space, professional body, can you share how higher education and more specifically OSUN can help or bridging the gender equity gap? That's part one. And then part two is what professional and personal civic skills can be provided in these environments that helps push the movement. So one part is what can higher and OSUN do, and then what are the skills that you need in some ways in the education environment to continue to move in this equity movement. So I'll go back to the original and start with Patricia.
There are so many studies that have been published lately that are talking about this inner empowerment that higher education has been providing for women. This innate, I think that's the term actually, innate empowerment. This means basically that women, now that they have the opportunity, the chance to go to pursue a degree in higher education, then they feel more empowered. However, the problem here is the following, that universities don't necessarily prepare women with the necessary skills so that after graduating, they can actually compete on the same level playing field with men. And that is called instrumental empowerment. And instrumental empowerment is something that OSUN, I believe, brings to the table, because we have, especially on the civic engagement side, we have so many programs where we are providing students with non-transferable skills. We are providing students with experiences and with opportunities where they can not only hone their already existing skills, but acquire new ones. And that is something that, and I'm talking from my own example, because I was a CU student before I started working for CU and OSUN, and I managed to acquire so many skills, and even more, I managed to hone my leadership skills that I was already having because of the opportunities that OSUN gave me, because I was also a global engagement fellow. I was participating in numerous events. So that is something that OSUN has already, and would be amazing if we could focus more on bringing more skills, creating more opportunities for students to acquire new skills, and especially women to acquire new skills. Because even though at the level of OSUN, we do have a great number of women that are participating in our programs, I think that we are not doing it. So when we are programming things, I don't think that we have been programming it to be on purpose focusing on women. So maybe that is something that we could do even more on top of everything that we have been doing. And that was the first question, Cammie, and the second question was?
That was great. The second question, you kind of touched on it, bridging the gap, but if there's any other things around skills that we should have, but I feel like you touched everything.
Perfect. Then I will pass it on to Emmy.
Thank you. I want to add on to what you said about preparation, because I've been learning a lot from what you've been saying about the women in the far right that you've been studying, and it's really interesting. And the motherhood aspect is what I'm thinking about. And I'm thinking about how women who plan to work aren't really prepared for being a mom and working. That's just not something that I think is commonly talked about in the higher education space, but it is a huge aspect. And yes, parenting is something that people of all genders do, but there is a certain aspect of motherhood that I think is unique and is just important to prepare yourself for, especially if you're pursuing a degree and plan to work. Yeah, so that's just something I was thinking about, and I think is really interesting. OSUN and higher education more generally can help with bridging the gap just by, I think, passing the to more women more often. By that I just mean I want to see more women in leadership roles and having a larger presence in male dominated fields like the degree I'm pursuing in economics. And in terms of education environments more generally, I think effective ways for women to be empowered are through spaces where women are given, you know, a platform to speak about their experiences with discrimination and you know, having a chance to gain practical skills about mitigating the harm of sexism and gender inequality. So I remember when I first got to BARD, I had to do a Title IX training online, and it was meant to teach students about how to be an ally and stand up against discrimination. And I just feel like there should be a lot more energy put into developing workshops and training to teach people how to recognize gender-based discrimination and deal with it appropriately. Like, I don't think that was enough, like that training that I did. And lastly, I just think that sexism and the patriarchy should be more prominent in class discussions. So in a class that I'm taking about the economics of war, there's an entire module dedicated to the violence against women that occurs in civil conflict. And I think that there's no reason why all classes shouldn't have like an element where students are thinking critically about gender equity and analyzing how the content they're learning relates to this issue. I just think there's kind of no excuse, and you know, it's related to everything. So there's no reason why it shouldn't be a part of the conversation. And I'll pass it to Yalda.
Well, when it comes to OSUN, I think one of the things I want to highlight is regarding the skills, of course, is leadership skills, because OSUN empowers students and does this in a very unique way. For example, the program that I had been, at the same time, you're a leader within your community, within your higher institutions, and at the same time, you're connected to the OSUN network. And in a way that it's not just the theory, but you're working it practical, learning from the network, from expert, and at the same time applying it within your campus, and at the same time sharing your experience and what you learn from the process within fellows, with others in the network. So it feels and makes students know their potential and how to be a leader in the ground and how to work basically practically, and not just like having the thought and learning about it, but to start working as a leader, so to become a true leader. And that's I really value within OSUN network, the enhancing of their leadership skills. And when it comes to higher education, as in the state, like most of the universities has this Title IX, but there are just some kind of basic workshop. And in the state, it has to be a part of curriculum, not only just the basic knowledge and awareness, because in this era, most of us know those basic topics, but actually the skill of critical thinking and learning and teaching the students how to react and how to address gender issues more objectively, rationally, and in a more logical sense. So that's a skill that needed to be a part of curriculum within higher education.
Well, thank you all so much for just being very thorough and engaging with that question. I think there were so many things that were coming through, and there's this generational empowerment, the focus on Black women, but also the reality that we have to talk. We have to talk about it. We can't run away from the difficult conversations. And if we're going to have this conversation, we need to be honest and open. And for higher ed and OSUN, you know, practicing the models that we discuss, as I said, I've been in this field for a long time. I've seen different aspects of civic engagement, social justice, and the fight for gender equity, and lived in different communities. And everyone loves to talk. As you said, Yalda, it's like, well, you got to do the work. If you want to see the change, then you have to practice that within the models and systems and communities that you're a part of. And I think that's really critical if we're going to see a shift. And so just letting the audience know, this is like the last general question for the panel. So if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. We'll definitely provide an opportunity for you to ask a question to our panelists. But I want to let you know we're about to transition to the final question, which is a really good transition for what we just discussed about doing the work. But we also know there's a reality to that, because we explored how higher ed, your campus, your community, they can all guide you in different ways in regards to giving you the skill sets and opportunity to talk about gender equity and launch projects and implement this work in different spaces. I feel like sometimes we're in a bubble here. I say that because when I left the bubble, then I saw like a different side to things personally, myself, even in different environments. And so sometimes this space can be more welcoming to challenging ideas, to being innovative and free-spirited. But sometimes innovative ideas and thoughts in regards to gender equity are not always welcomed. And that's the hard reality that we live in, especially with the new generation, which I really do like y'all a lot, because I'm a millennial and we were just always crying about things and we were trying to start stuff. And then Gen Z came through and y'all just do, and you don't care. And when I say you don't care what people think about you. You're going to stand in your truth. You're going to utilize the resources to do the work. And that's very different, but also exciting in regards to civic work. So can you share with our audience, because this is an intergenerational approach to this. Yes, it's this generation, but there's a lot that we can learn. Can you share what tactics or skills one should or can do when they reach resistance with their work, especially against gender equity? What can you do? What resources are out there? How do you maintain the focus and the fight to continue to do the work? Because it's hard sometimes. I'll transition to Emmy to start first on this.
So if we think about what this resistance could potentially look like, for example, if someone is disagreeing with something you've said in the spirit of gender equity, or even says something offensive, it's hard. It's hard when you reach moments like that. I've definitely had my experience with that, with fighting for racial equity in New York City public schools. I would be in city council meetings where parents were saying, like, we don't want kids like you in our schools, like you bring drugs and violence. Like, it's really hard to be in those spaces and to stand up against that. But it's really essential for being effective in this work. And so I just over time come to the acceptance that everyone is entitled to their own beliefs and opinions. But this doesn't mean people get to be hateful. I want to emphasize that. And so I think ways we should deal with that type of disagreement and polarization is simply by hearing people out and using evidence-based arguments to convey our points. Like, I can't emphasize enough how important like bringing the facts out are, but it just really strengthens our agenda. And you know, it's how, it's not necessarily about convincing people, but it's how you educate and spread awareness. Yeah, and not getting too bogged down by like not being able to change people's minds. Just keep it pushing. And then I just wanted to mention some resources that came to mind for education about gender equity. So there's like tons of literature about feminist theory, and I know I want more people to read authors like Toni Morrison and Bell Hooks, and there's just so many resources. We all have internet access, or a lot of us do, and you know, just take the time and research. And yeah, I was just reading an article from the International Labor Organization about a new social contract, they call it, about promoting gender equity in the workforce and labor market, which is really interesting. So yeah, there's a ton of resources out there. And in terms of the institutions that you are all a part of, there should be like authority figures to help people deal with issues of gender violence or discrimination. Yeah, and counselors to help you cope with struggles. And if there aren't, then come to people in this room and, you know, just reach out to your network and you will find the support that you need. And I'll pass it to Yalda.
I believe that when it comes to resistance, like we have to be specific what exactly we mean, but like who are against it, like it differs. For example, at some points I see students are having conflicting ideas with each other, even like the new generation. It's not that it's just in the past. And at some points, like we see that the need is for some kind of active listening and being more rational and objective toward them, and see that like especially when I interact with international students, it's somehow we can notice that everyone can with different biases from different stereotypes that they bring with them, unfortunately. And at some points I think we need to listen to them and help them to know why they have these biases and how they overcome, or actually why they believe so. Because in college life, especially, sometimes I like when I talk with freshman students, I see that this is a life-changing era for them to learn. And sometimes they're unaware of their biases because they just enter a new community, a diverse community, but still we can't like expect them to change it overnight. So it is in a level, I think, the basic level that we can help them, and changes, I think, more promising in that sense that we can help them and we can ask for help ourselves. But when I say we have to see who is against it, it's different. I mean that if I refer to the Taliban who are currently in Afghanistan, I can't see like any kind of negotiation with them. There is a misogynistic group who doesn't believe anything in regard of gender equity, gender equality, women's rights, or anything. So on that sense, I think it's more serious when we discuss it. And I believe that working for gender equity is starting at an individual level. But if we want to continue and we want to achieve our mission and to work toward an equal and inclusive community, we have to work together and support each other no matter where we live in or where we are from.
Okay, so I would answer this question by making a comparison between top-down tactics and let's put it a bottom-up tactics. So when we think of when I think at least of the top-down tactics, I'm thinking of the sort of policies and programs and projects that governments and states are creating in order to enhance gender equity. And the first thing that comes to my mind is, for instance, this was the resolution from the UN from Women, Peace and Security, which talks about gender mainstreaming. And it basically refers that each and every UN member state should implement the concept of gender mainstreaming in all aspects of the society. So just like we have a GDPR consultant in every company, we should have a gender consultant or a gender mainstreaming consultant in every institution in the state. So this is something that I really believe in. And even though there are states that haven't been still implementing this resolution, and I'm coming from a state that didn't implement this resolution yet, I still think that at least we have this safety net that this resolution created, which can be afterwards based and strengthened based on the bottom-up approach, meaning that we as women, or we as individuals, and not only us, men as well, we should be trying to, and this is happening through, for instance, advocacy groups. The fact that we are raising awareness, coupled with educational resources that, for instance, Amy was talking about, is something that each and every individual can work with in order to advocate further and to create to narrow down the gap, so to say, so that this top-down resolution from the UN, together with other government policies, can be combined with the willingness of the population, because this is what it is at the end of the day, the willingness of the population and of its members to work towards creating more inclusive workspaces, family spaces, and so on. And as an individual, I think that I'm also having different tactics when it comes to my professional life and my personal life. Because when it comes to my professional life, I was lucky enough to work and develop in progressive and inclusive spaces, meaning that even if I am coming across somebody who would try to disagree with me and the point would not make sense professionally, but would have to do with the fact that I am a woman and it happened to me, then I'm always using logic and I'm always using arguments and facts to show that I'm right. But this is an extra effort that I have to put in just to make my point. Personally, it's even harder. And going back to the whole intersectionality question that we had, I moved to a new country when I started studying, and I'm coming from a country that is quite prejudiced in Europe. And when I moved in here and I interacted with somebody from Austria, the first thing they asked me when I told them that I'm from Romania was whether I'm a Roma person or whether I'm a prostitute, which says more about the way women from my region, which is Eastern Europe, are perceived in Western Europe, and the whole hurdles we have to put up with, not only me, but every woman that is coming here in order to make themselves heard and to make themselves seen. So for the tactics that I could apply, because the way I brushed it off at that point was just, telling him that you don't have the right to tell me this, and how can you say that? But that was a defensive mechanism. I still don't know, and I'm still working on with myself to try to find the best tactics to tackle this sort of microaggression, so to say, in my personal life. But I think that the fact that I am trying to be more understanding with myself and to try to be more understanding of other people and understand where they're coming from is maybe a short-term tactic that works for now.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that story, Patricia. We really appreciate that. I think the three of you really brought forth and weaved it really well about the importance of, yes, we need evidence-based arguments, but that's a lot of work on us to do that. And so the more people that are educated and willing to do the research, the more that we can shift and bring the facts forth in our different environments that we're in, but also talking about the reality that the work looks different based on your geographical location. As I mentioned earlier in the beginning, your socioeconomic status, your gender, your race, it all impacts that intersectionality piece as to how you're viewed in society and how you view yourself. And that can really bog you down. But I really like that all of you also talked about the importance of your network. And I think that's one thing I want to bring home when individuals are listening. They're like, well, how do I start? How do I get into this? And there's so many different networks, whether it's the OSUN network, which Caitlin talked about different ways to get involved there, or it's your school, or maybe it's your friends, or maybe it's your faith and spirituality. If those spaces are welcoming to these conversations, because not always, but depending on where you're located, that may be. So these are all different ways of just starting the conversation, starting the movement. And I don't want to make the assumption that you haven't, and that's to our audience members. So there's a lot of different ways to maneuver and do this work and to start your journey into the fight of gender equity, which all of our speakers have shown is very different and unique. I did want to open it to the floor quickly to see if anyone had any questions or thoughts. You can use the chat or you can raise your hand. And maybe we covered everything, which I know we haven't. But if not, like if you're still thinking, I would like to maybe do a final thought from our speakers in regards to where do you see the future of gender equity? What are your thoughts just about that, final thoughts around this conversation, where you see us headed?
I'm a very optimistic person, so I just hope that the future is going to be bright when it comes to gender equity. But I think I'm basing my answer on the fact that in the recent years there has been so much discussion around this topic, and there are a lot of critical voices saying that there is only discussion happening but nothing concrete, which is true in some aspects. But just like with, it's just like memorizing a play or memorizing a song. You have to listen to it multiple times so you can memorize it. And I believe that is the same when it comes to these discussions, because we are always listening to them. We are always paying attention to what is happening. We are trying to find answers, and at the same time, we are trying to find solutions, practical solutions. And it's a generational change. I have a 5-year-old nephew who will grow up in a society that will be more inclusive than the society that I grew up in, for the sole fact that the younger generations are stumbling across this topic more often and are paying more attention and are raising even more awareness about it than we did, or than the generation before me did. So it will be I don't think that gender equity will be solved in the short term, but I do believe that in the long term, given the way we are moving now and given the consistency of our actions, I think that it's very possible that we will manage to obtain it.
When I think about the future of gender equity, I think about my younger brother, who was raised by mostly my mother and me. And so being raised by two women, he's grown up with this awareness about gender equity and, the ways that he is responsible for being an ally and empowering women and, treating all humans, but particularly women, with respect and kindness and compassion. And so I think the future is just raising more children, especially boys, to be better and to dismantle systems of patriarchy. And I also see the future of gender equity as being super intertwined with all other areas of social justice and equity. It's the future of ending war and creating a better economic system that provides security for all people. I think it's all part of the same movement that we're all experiencing right now. And I'm maybe less optimistic than Patricia, but I do have hope that good things are coming in future generations, hopefully. Thank you.
Yeah, just a short note that, as I mentioned before, that we can acknowledge we have a long way, but still we have a long way ahead. And as Patricia mentioned, the new generation is one of the source of inspiration, I think, how they are passionate to work for a better future, but still, I think it's important to know that in the pace that we are going and working for gender equity is different. In some parts, we are starting from scratch, and some parts we already have quite good achievements and improvement on that to work on that. So I think it's a long-term process, and it should be continuous and non-stop, because we are not working in a same level in every country or every region of the world. When it starts from scratch, it's quite different, the progressive and how it's progressive and how it's not. So I just want to highlight that.
Yeah, thank you so much for reminding us about that, Yalda, that we're coming from different perspectives in this work. And that's why it's important to be connected with each other, especially in a network such as this. One last thing that we want to do before concluding is just give you opportunity to hear of different ways you can be involved and engage around gender equity, particularly in OSUN. So I was just going to transition it back to Caitlin, and I just want to thank our panelists so much for such a thoughtful conversation. I'm hoping that this leads our audience members want to get further involved and engage with this conversation. As I said, it's a marathon, not a sprint. And with that being said, since it is a marathon, Caitlin is going to share some different ways that you can be engaged quickly. I know she put some stuff in the chat just now.
So very timely. This whole panel was not an advertisement for one sort of fellowship program that applications are live for, but there is an open application call for a new type of fellowship position that is actually called OSUN Leadership Fellows. And I know Patricia is part of that. So if I leave anything out, please just let me know. But this is a great example of something that you can get involved in from your own campus. This is a group of people who will be working on leadership development and then applying some of those skills that you learn to your own campus. So it's a really good way of connecting leadership across OSUN and to your own campus. So if you are a student and are interested in that, please take a look. Across OSUN, we have other various opportunities for students. I saw Zar, I don't know if she's still on the call, but I saw her pop in. She coordinates the Global Engagement Fellows program. And I know Yalda and Emmy and Patricia actually have all been part of that program. That's a program in particular for community engaged leaders who, again, are in a position with a bit more experience and expertise to mentor younger and maybe students who are just starting out on community engagement. And we do skills building, we do community building with that program. Throughout OSUN, we also have a student-led publication, and we have editorial board positions that open up each year. And so that's another good way across OSUN to get involved. You can run a publication and like have that experience both on your resume and in practice. And what an opportunity that would be. We have opportunities for students who might just want to be peer mentors for students taking courses within OSUN, and those are called remote ambassadors, and they help facilitate community and help make sure that students are going through courses in a supported way. So those are just a few positions that are that opportunities pop up for to join. The Leadership Fellows application just happens to be open right now, but keep an eye out on the website. A lot of your campus coordinators will push out information, pay attention. Don't be afraid to apply. I would say if you're on a call and if you're on this call, and maybe the one thing I can leave you with is if you see something that you might be interested in, but you don't think you have 100% of the skill set or experience to apply, still apply, because the worst that can happen is that you are declined, maybe with some feedback on how to improve for next time. We are a community that really wants to bring people in, not push people out. And most of the time, if you do have, 60% of the skills needed for a position, like you're more equipped than you think. And there are tons of mobility opportunities that can help bring you out of your own community, sort of what Emmy was saying in the beginning of the panel, to help contextualize your thinking of the world and thinking about gender equity in particular. So pay attention, get involved in a way that works for you. And I would say in your own campuses, like practice getting into leadership positions, whether that is your TA for a class, you're participating in student government, you are working in your residence halls as a mentor. The more leadership positions that you maybe find yourself in, that'll magnify. And we need you to be developing these skills, because as the panelist said, we are optimistic, but we need more people like everyone on this call to be really equipped to step in whenever that moment calls. And so pay attention to OSUN opportunities and to opportunities on your own campus to practice these skills. And thank you. This was just a really rich conversation. Is leaving me a lot to think about. And I guess they're just both small and big ways to keep advocating for gender equity, and that's what I'm hearing. And there are ways that we interact with one another that might perpetuate some of the issues that we want to be healing from. And then also there are ways that you can show up in the world as someone who is that healing, towards healing harms that have been done, working towards gender equity. Like, we can work on that as individuals, we can work on that in small teams in our workplace, and then we can also work on that on a larger scale. And I think in any given day, that's going to be, you're going to step into it at a different level, but as long as we're sort of working on things in small ways every day, I think I can be I can leave this call optimistic as well. So I'll turn things over to the panel for any wiser and more eloquent closing words, but this has been a real fun 90 minutes.
Oh, we appreciate you, Caitlin, for helping us, as well as Christina, She's still here behind the scenes for helping us put this together. And yeah, I just wanted to thank our panelists for this conversation today. It was really timely, I feel, in so many different ways, especially thinking about what's next in this work around empowerment, equity, and inclusion in regards to gender equity rights. As we said earlier when we started this out, the month of March is a launch pad, so to speak, for the other months of the year to be kind of like the catalyst in doing this work consistently and practically. And I think that's something that's key. And I'm sure you're not thinking this, but maybe you are, I don't know. But if you're wondering why gender equity matters, regardless of where you live, gender equity is a human right. And so I really want to bring that home. It's a fundamental human right. Advancing this work is critical to all areas for a healthy, egalitarian democracy and society. And when we do this work together, we can create change. And that's change that reduces a lot of the things that we talk about in the civic engagement world, whether it's like reducing poverty, providing education access, food insecurity, access to health services, sexual and reproductive health services and rights and prevention, education, voting rights. Like all those different civic things we talk about are all interconnected and weaved into this work. And so we have to make progress because, as I mentioned earlier, the pandemic has impacted us greatly and it's going to for generations to come. And we have ground to make up, but we haven't lost everything, as our panelists have shown us. We are aware that this global network is united in a lot of different ways to make this complex work accessible, to make us have these conversations about inequitable systems. And then how do we create different standards, I should say, around this? It can make us feel helpless at times when we hear the different stories, but I also leave with a hope that there is work to be done and that there are people that are willing to do it. And we don't have all the answers, as many of us said on the panel, we don't have the answers, but we don't want the work to stagnate and let our progress falter. So we believe in practical action. We have our pathway to this work. We can connect with our communities and we can continue to discuss the different ways that we can do the work and actually go into action. So, and those are my final thoughts with all of this. And I also just want to thank the panel and everyone and just continue to be a part of this work, engage in this work. Contact Caitlin or Patricia or Emmy or any of them, they're all available. And that's one thing I say that's very unique about this network is that you can reach out to each other and people will answer. So with that being said, thank you so much and wishing you a very successful, hopefully not stressful April.